I I want to first of all welcome everybody here in the new online Hot Politics Lab. This started in March of this year when the pandemic hits us, and we decided to continue our meetings not in the building of the University of Amsterdam, but actually online, which also allowed us to broaden our network a lot more and invite people from other places, such as Vienna today, to come and talk to us, and people from other places to actually listen in. So for those of you who don't remember anymore, the Hot Politics Lab is a broadly oriented lab in the psychological, emotional, psychological dispositions, origins of human behavior, both elites and citizens, and people from different fields of the social sciences are member of the lab. Today we have Julian Aichholzer from the University of Vienna. The Department of Government is joining us today. His work is important in the field of political psychology. He studies questions such as the role of psychological disposition, understanding populism, something that also members of the Hot Politics Lab have done in the past. He has also important methodological contributions on how we should do complex statistical modeling right. And today he will give a talk on how to actually measure the personality traits of political elites. As always, Julian will first give a talk, and then you can use the Q&A box in the Zoom function to ask your questions, and the talk will be moderated by Gijs with his new microphone. So I'm very excited about that part of the talk as well. Julian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So first of all, thanks very much to Gijs, Beat, and Christian for inviting me and bringing people together on such an important topic as political psychology. The second thing I want to say before I start, so with the topic I went kind of astray from what was planned, so I talked with Gijs, and this has much to do with projects don't work as planned. So what I promised, I cannot fully present you today, but I thought it still makes sense to talk about personality in politicians, and with the research I've been following kind of the last couple of months or a year. So I will now try to start, connect my presentation, and you tell me if it works or not. So can you see my presentation?
Yeah.
Yes or no? Wonderful. Okay. So as you can see, what I want to present to you today is about the really about preferences for certain personality traits. So as you can see, the topic personality in politicians is still in there, but it's more from the citizen's view. And this is kind of what I've been doing the last time. Okay, so I try to make this quick but still comprehensive. So the background of this whole theme here is kind of a general political science question: what do citizens expect from their political representatives or leaders? We find several questions of that in the literature already, and I try to narrow this down to which traits do people expect in an ideal politician. And this kind of question of what is the ideal politician, or what do I want to see, expect, call it trait preferences. This has already been studied in the 80s by Kinder and colleagues, or more recently by Roets and Van Hiel. So this is the kind of stream that I will be following. And the next slide gives you an overview of the idea behind it, because I think that is what personality actually describes, and I guess most of you are familiar with that, is that it's fundamental tendencies in behavior, or more broadly, stable tendencies in behavior, cognition, and emotions. And this is what I find interesting here. What do citizens actually expect in terms of these fundamental tendencies described by personality? And others have called this a kind of a mental schema that people have in mind when they talk about politicians. So this could represent policy preferences of that politician, but also his or her leadership style and actually conduct when the person is in office. So Miller and colleagues have talked about this in the 80s. Okay, the plan of the presentation here is to look at this idea, what do citizens actually expect in terms of personality? Look at this from different angles. The first will be to talk about personality congruence, so meaning similarity with that politician, so a self versus politician comparison. And at the same time, looking at how do average citizens compare to politicians. So maybe do they expect certain leader traits or being more exceptional? And the second part of the presentation will be on ideology and partisan affiliation, how that relates to trait preferences in politicians. And finally, the third part is on context or situation dependency of what people expect in politicians. And I try to summarize with these nice words: similarity, exceptionality, affinity, and adaptivity to describe these different angles to explain leader trait preferences. Okay, a few words only on previous research. As I said, this has been done in the 80s, starting with this paper by Kinder and colleagues. What is the profile of an ideal president? And they started out with trying to use different categories, saying some traits might be personality, others might be more related to performance. They could be positive or negative. And it's kind of a mixture sometimes. It's not that clear what is here actually only personality or performance. So it's, of course, the first approach. And if you have some time left, you can, of course, compare these traits mentioned with the current president. So is he or she really honest, appoints good advisors, and so forth? This is just a funny side note. But starting with that, you can also go on in the literature and see what others have done. There's a similar distinction trying to make this comparison of performance or personality, and of course, they do not always fully match one-to-one, but other people came up with this distinction of, let's say, competence versus character, energy extraversion versus agreeableness, friendliness. So all of these literatures try to provide a framework of describing personality. And there's certainly not one right or wrong, but came up with kind of similar ideas how to approach this. And my view is, this is also what I try to argue here, is that candidate traits in the political science literature are not always that clear, cannot clearly be mapped also what has been used in the personality psychology literature. At least that's my view. So what I want to do is to provide a framework or use these frameworks for the study I've been doing so using either Big Five or the so-called hexachord traits, so 5 or 6 traits that could be described as fundamental personality dimensions, or more broadly, the Big Two traits, which are agency and communion. And these can be very useful to link them to either ideology or other factors. So it makes it more simple to map certain candidate traits on other factors. Okay, just very brief overview on background. So let's start with the first study I've been doing, which is on being more similar but also exceptional, what might citizens expect from their politicians. And this has recently been published in the Journal of Research in Personality. And I just want to show you the general idea of this paper, okay? So the general assumptions that I and my colleague Johanna had were citizens would seek traits or skills necessary for a leading position. So you could see this from different angles, but it's basically about working effectively with public, being in a leader position, or communicate effectively. And people would generally see desired leadership traits in a politician. So there might be distinct traits that characterize leaders. Secondly, citizens would follow the homophily or congruence principle. This has been argued by Caprara and Zimbardo. So look for someone who is more similar to yourself, basically. And this similarity, as we argue, may ensure some kind of effective closeness. So you just feel closer to that person. It might be more similar, but in the end also ideological representation. So it's more likely that that person will also represent your basic views on politics. We used 2 studies here, just very briefly. One was from Austria in a representative sample. This is kind of the unique point here. And we used bipolar trait adjectives. So describe personality with short adjectives, bipolar traits, so use opposites to describe personality. We use self-ratings and the ones of an ideal politician. And the same thing basically did in Germany with a less representative but still broad convenience sample, and using even more trait adjectives to look at this. And just give you the results more generally, what we find is that the ideal politician is most of these things you could expect, should be more emotionally stable, more extrovert, conscientious, meaning disciplined, orderly, but also somehow more open, meaning self-aware, but also weighing options carefully. And finally, should be more honest, which is empirically maybe not the case, but at least that's what people desire in comparison to the average citizen. Okay, and with regard to agreeableness, we did not find such clear patterns with regard to what makes an ideal politician. In terms of congruence, so meaning how do people compare themselves and the ideal politician, there is strong congruence and openness and agreeableness, also morality, which means these are the traits that are, I would say, most strongly linked to basic values. And this has also been shown in the literature or kind of corroborates that. So it's about assumed similarity on these basic value traits. And as we know, openness and agreeableness are also those traits most strongly linked, I would say, with ideological preferences. And finally, we also show that this similarity is partly mediated by core ideological views. So meaning this similarity comes about because people are some more authoritarian or socially dominant individuals will, of course, expect certain traits in a politician. And this last point kind of motivated the next piece of research that I'm currently working on. This is about how ideology motivates preferences, more specifically for agency and communion traits as broad categories. So what kind of politicians do certain people want to see, meaning according to their political leanings. This has also been mentioned by Lawson, for example, previously, that trait preferences are kind of ideologically motivated. And secondly, this would unveil kind of a representation of what people expect in terms of policy and leadership styles. I already mentioned this schema model of Miller and colleagues. And finally, typical candidate traits, this is what I wanted to argue here as well, can be well distinguished and mapped onto this agency communion duality and its subdimensions. So this helps us to link leader or politician trait preferences to ideology. That's what I argue. Okay, the data that I use here come from a cross-country study, actually in 7 European countries, broad samples on quota on gender, age, education, and region. So these are large samples and more or less representative. Most importantly, the trait adjectives, again, that we use to describe how would you describe your ideal politician or what makes a good politician, are the following. For agency and assertiveness, we used dominance and vigorousness as overall categories and summarized them. Competence is measured basically by intellect, so being intellectual as a goal. Communion and warmth, it's a separate dimension that means basically compassion, to seek compromise, but also to remain calm emotionally, not to get angry or distressed. And finally, communion morality dimension is measured by to admit mistakes versus to basically show no regrets with your conduct. Okay, and the predictors we use come from a vote recall question, meaning Chapel Hill expert survey, left-right distinctions mainly, but also the populist classification, so by you and your colleagues, to also separate populist voters in particular. And as ideological predictors, we used right-wing authoritarianism and social dominance orientation scales. So the reasoning here was that these basic ideological views would also be useful in terms of differential predictive validity, meaning they will predict specific trait preferences. Okay, again, very short, and this is as minimum technical as possible. So the results here come from a basic OLS regression, meaning the trait preferences that people express in the surveys will be regressed on their either party preference or political views. So in that case, you can see that right-wing voters really show a distinct profile, and this basically, by and large, I would say corroborates US research, meaning that right-wing voters show a distinct preference for lower warmth and morality traits, so downregulation of these traits, but greater assertiveness and lower preference for intellect, meaning kind of a disregard of that certain trait, And on the other hand, looking at what makes populist voters unique, we just find a unique disregard of this intellect trait, which maybe doesn't come as a surprise. It's kind of could be interpreted as a elite cue or being more progressive in a way, or belonging to a elite or being more adapted to the establishment. That's why it's rejected. Okay, and then the second step, as I said, I wanted to look more in depth on core ideological preferences, meaning social dominance orientation and right-wing authoritarianism. And what I find here is, this is from the pooled sample, is really that they have distinct predictive validity, meaning social dominance orientation really is associated with lower warmth and morality preference. In turn, authoritarianism would predict greater assertiveness, which I did not expect in my hypothesis, but a lower intellect, which was expected. So this assertiveness link is also could be explained by the measures that I use. So in, as you know, in authoritarian measures, you also have this preference for strong leaders, for example, and that kind of translate into stronger dominance and vigorousness as trait expectations. Okay, and the final presentation here is on the third study together with Lasse Lawson from Aarhus. So here we look at preferences for personality traits in times of threats or certain conflict conditions. Okay, so this is more experimental in terms of research design. Here our general assumptions are based on the previous research. You might know that much of the research is focused on dominance traits as kind of being triggered by certain conflict or war scenarios. So either physical dominance or male stereotype traits. But this helps us to kind of use a certain theoretical background, which is adaptive followership theory, which means that citizens will adapt their preferences to certain contexts, basically. So what do they then expect in a leader to lead their country and help driving through a crisis? And finally, we had specific expectations on which traits would then get more or less importance, will be up or down regulated. And with regard to agency, we expected that greater assertiveness but lower openness would be important. On the other hand, communion traits would be downregulated, meaning lower warmth, compassion, agreeableness, but also lower morality, being less honest, for example. Okay, and so far we conducted 2 studies, one from Germany. Again, this is, I already mentioned that, it's from a population convenience sample. We used, again, these 10 bipolar trait adjectives to look at trait preferences, and we had self-ratings and questions on the ideal leader. I will show you the description. And also a smaller study from Denmark using a student sample where we tried the same thing, using a different measure, the TIPI personality scale, both for self and the ideal leader descriptions. Okay. So the treatment that we used here to kind of induce this conflict scenario was in both cases, so Germany and Denmark, we used a scenario of, just mention it briefly, imagine a dispute between Germany and Russia over gas supplies that has flared up. Diplomatic relations have been completely broken off, and Russia threatens Germany and demands that all sanctions against the country be lifted immediately, and so forth. Now, please indicate what kind of politician you would prefer at the top of Germany to lead the country safely through this crisis situation. And the control condition, which is more general about whom do you expect to lead the country and to ensure that the population is doing well. Okay? Basically, this similar setup in the Danish study. All right, and again, very brief result summary. So what we find so far is that in this threat scenario, a leader is expected to be more reserved on the one hand, but also self-controlled, so be much more emotionally stable. Again, as we expected, more pitiless or tough and lower morality. So these are down-regulated communion traits. And with regard to the other traits, we had mixed results. So for conscientiousness, there was some pattern for being more orderly, but not self-disciplined and sort of self-restrained. With regard to extroversion, it was also mixed. So less sociability, as I mentioned, being more reserved, but of course being more assertive. This again is a dominance trait. And it's partly supported as a leader in that crisis threat scenario should also be less open-minded. And the last point, this was not expected, self-leader congruence. So again, comparing measures of self-personality and leader descriptions were rather similar across conditions. This is not what we expected. We thought that the similarity would be decreased in this threat scenario. And brief outlook to mention this, and maybe can also talk about this, or if you have ideas, I'm happy to hear them. So we plan a follow-up study which should be pre-registered on the US, and we use more extensive personality measures, BFI2, battery, and also honesty humility measures, so more developed and validated measures in that case. And we want to use 3 groups: armed conflict scenario, as previously mentioned, but also the current disease threat seems to matter as an important condition, so we try to use that as well. And what we still struggle with is to find a control situation so that people really think about kind of a neutral scenario, which is not immediately triggers the coronavirus situation, of course. Okay, so this isn't just an outlook what we will be doing. Okay, so I hope you're still with me. I'll try to summarize this briefly, what I told you. So there's some support from what we found here that political leaders are really considered to be exceptional, meaning there are some traits that you could define as being leader traits in terms of political leaders. So they are really distinguishable from average citizens. Congruence and similarity matters. This has been shown in the past, but we can find here that it's really highest on the traits that reflect core values or are associated with core values of people. With regard to ideology, there's some consistency of ideology trait preferences. So I didn't show you country results, but there's really strong consistency across the countries that, again, social dominance orientation, right-wing authoritarianism have differential predictive validity, and that works kind of consistently across several political contexts. And finally, there's some support for this adaptive leader-follower relationships. The situational demand is mirrored in what citizens expect from a leader, and certain traits come along with that. And we can find this so far in 2 different countries, and we want to extend that further, of course. Okay, I also wanted to provide some open questions for discussion, maybe. So what does it mean for personalization of politics? So what I thought about here was, do politicians really create a consistent public image, for example, on social media channels? Is there something that we could measure, maybe, that is public personality that is present and also consistently conveyed via social media channels, because this is the most immediate contact, perhaps, between citizens and politicians? Does it have implications for political accountability and candidate quality? So there's this general assumption that morality and intellect is the main goal for what a politician should look like. But is it really the case? So as we could see, some people might prioritize morality and intellect less in comparison to others. And this matters in a situation of, as we see it, for example, a Trump and post-truth era that we observe today. The third point I wanted to raise is who benefits from such conflict and crisis situations. So what I talked about in the third study, is it really the case that certain politicians can benefit from that? So create or manufacture a mood of crisis to their advantage. I think this is an important point to be tackled. And finally, fit of candidate traits in established personality frameworks. I think it really makes sense to think about that and what you are studying and whether this could be placed in established theories, and this will, as I would say, help you to also link that to other phenomena in the social world. And limitations mentioned last, then I finished, sorry. What I promised but did not present today, so the next step would also be using standardized personality measures, which are suitable for rating politicians. What I found most difficult sometimes is that not always the case that the trait adjectives, descriptions of what is personality in established measures map the job of politicians. I think this is in some cases quite obvious, and we try to work on that currently. We want to extend this to other contexts, so not only Europe, but of course, US is a very interesting example. And finally, we have to find a way also to include other moderators, of course, especially any interaction with gender of the politician would be important, because what we study here is really a kind of a generic picture of what a leader looks like. And this has several flaws, of course, but I think the next step is also to go into more detail with other moderators. Okay, a bit over the time, but I hope you stayed with me. So thank you very much for listening and watching, and I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Julian. And yeah, I'm happy to say there are 23 people from all over the world listening to you, and they stayed with you throughout the whole 20 minutes of this great talk. I think, I mean, you apologized in the beginning, but I think actually what you've shown us is maybe even more interesting than what the standardized, but yeah, I don't know, maybe the standardized measures will even be more interesting. I don't know, a lot of food for thought for the next 30 minutes. And I want to say to everyone, welcome back. I hope everyone had a good holiday. I had a good holiday, at least. And as always, you can now write your questions in the Q&A box, the two balloons that you'll see in the middle, down in the middle of the Zoom screen. And I will read out the questions. Okay, the first question is from Sanne van Oosten. It's been there for a while. I hope it's still relevant, but we can always trust Sanne with asking a relevant and a quick question. The question is, very interesting that you measure congruence. Could you tell us more about how you measure this exactly?
Yeah, of course. Also, thanks for the questions, and thanks for all the people who joined and stayed with me this long talk. So on the question, it's very simple. So in all the surveys, not all of them, but in most of them, we used self-ratings of personality, and basically the same measures then for asking what, in your view, what is the ideal politician like? Okay, so just to mention that it's in that case, you already noticed that the trait adjectives that you use should be suitable both for describing the average citizen, so yourself, but also a politician. So in some cases, that wouldn't make sense. So some items that you know from personality scales are less suitable, I would say. But it's basically the correlation between self-ratings and what people reported to expect in a politician.
Okay, thanks. I think that addresses Sanne's question. I don't have another question yet, but oh no, I do. Matthijs Rodijn, he asks, hi Julian, very interesting presentation. In your last study, you showed that trait preferences in a leader mirror the situational demand. So when exposed to a threatening situation, people value certain things in a politician. Yet you also found that self-leader congruence was similar across conditions. Does it imply that the threat exposure has also affected how people score on their own personality?
Thanks, Matthias. No, because the self-ratings were, of course, measured before the experimental treatment. But I agree with you that this is not what you normally expect, because in general, I would say that what you then describe is even more exceptional person, a leader that has kind of distinctive, maybe even extreme traits to kind of cope with this crisis situation. But I think what it could show is that the traits, regardless of your own personality, so that it's always kind of upregulated and so on different levels, but it's quite equal. So you just shift the intercept, if you speak more technically. This might be what it shows, but it's still worth further investigation. That's what we want to do in the US study. Thanks. Good question.
Matthias says thanks. And I'm now going to Patrick Stewart. Thanks for the very interesting talk. I'm interested in how you would frame the disease/pandemic vignettes. For instance, in the United States, there's been a focus by Trump on blaming outsiders and congruent policies, whereas other politicians focus more on community actions. How would you approach this?
Yeah, well, thanks, Patrick. So the question is how you frame or how you trigger this situation of disease, pandemic, in a situation where we have a disease, a pandemic around us. That's actually the difficult part. And we wanted to just stress that this pandemic is really rising, and it threatens the lives of people in the US in that case. So kind of really make it even more salient and stress that impact. That's why I said it's difficult to compare this with a neutral situation. So there might be a little of a difference to if you talk about, that's what we thought about. So think about a year in the past, not mentioning the pandemic at all, so not trigger that, and ask what they thought could be should be a good politician. But really the idea was to stress even more this situation that we currently have and its impact on lives in the US. Yeah. I hope that answers your question.
Yep. Okay. Next, the question is from Alex Kioskevich, also from the US. Thanks for your presentations. Thanks for your presentation. Are you concerned at all about measurement error in personality attenuating your effects? In other words, if you had longer personality measures, would you expect that your results could change in terms of finding additional effect that may be obscured now?
Well, thanks, Alexander. Short answer, yes, I am concerned. And, of course, I'm always concerned with measurement error. I've worked a lot with structural equation modeling. So the next step would be to have very both fine-grained, more extensive, validated measures that should prevent that. So it could be that some of the things we find are even somewhat more stronger, I would say. But I also have to stress that one way to approach this was, at least in the second study, this cross-country comparison to really see if that is something that we find consistently across countries, and having a huge sample that also kind of increases my confidence that some patterns are more stable, I would say. Yeah.
Okay. I actually had a follow-up question from Patrick Stewart question. And because before you showed the last two slides, I wrote down what about the threats, the different threats that Mark van Vught identifies in his work. So there's the threats in terms of war, but also in terms of disease, in terms of technological change, and I think he has one more condition. But I forgot it. Okay, and then I see you introduce this this disease element will introduce it in a follow-up study. And I thought Patrick's question is kind of interesting because, on the one hand, Van Vught has sort of this argument about that in cases of disease, it's more sort of the care component of leadership that becomes more important. I think he argues there that female leaders become more appreciated. But at the same time, thinking about Lasse's work, well, maybe more Michael Bang-Peterson's work about disease and skin tone, right? His work on immigration. So for me, disease seems to be sort of really a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it has this care component. On the other hand, it has this sort of outsider skin tone type of anti-immigration nasty stuff side.
I would agree. So it's a good question. So first of all, I would be happy if you send me the work you just mentioned. So and with the threat triggers that we haven't used. So my answer would be that I would also expect this, what you, for example, see in a post-disaster scenario, so after an earthquake or some natural disaster. I would also agree there could be some component that makes kind of increases a pro-sociality among members of a community. At the same time, it's still a kind of a life threat in a way, and I'm also not sure how it plays out, but I would think that in comparison to this, so we should ask what is the source of that threat maybe? So is it human-made, like terror or a certain group from outside, an external threat that you can name and also attack, or is it a kind of unknown threat that will impact us all? Then this is really a different situation, and that's why I also think it will have different outcomes in terms of which politicians should address that threat in a way. But again, thanks for that comment. I'm happy for more input on that.
Next question, Bert. Is that? Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Julian, for this really interesting talk. I'd like you to tell me a little bit more about what this now means for that citizens rate politicians as desired on certain traits, because does this now mean that they vote for certain politicians, or are they actually just portraying a picture that fits with their ideological identity? I think they have reports. I'm liberal, so I should report that I prefer politicians that do this and this. And I'd ask this because, on the one hand, the first-hand reading of the personality politics literature seems to suggest that it's Jost is right all over the place. Personality is causing ideology, but the few panel studies that are out there actually seem to suggest that the causal pathways in both directions. And work by Stephen Ludecki in political psychology, for instance, suggests that people actually, for self-presentational reasons, are reporting traits, are reporting being more open, while in fact they're actually not that open. So are we now looking at an artifact of ideology, or are we looking at sincere preferences?
It's a good question. I guess it cannot be answered in 1 or 2 minutes.
Oh, we have time.
Maybe an hour. No, be honest, of course, that's the basic question of, especially with correlational studies. And I also would stress this as a limitation. So you could say that, for example, partisans of a right-wing party, then they already have in mind a certain politician that they know, and they will report a picture that best fits that politician that they like a lot, for example. You know? So that that case, causality would be the other way around, I would say. So it's, but on the other hand, I would say it's really quite informative that certain, at least that's how I see it, that certain worldviews, if you see ideology as kind of a worldview, that's really different trait expectations go hand in hand. So you really want to see someone who is more, for example, more caring and compassionate with people living in a social community. So we do not neglect minorities and so forth. And this is reflected in certain traits, I would say. Does it say anything about causality? I'm not sure. As I said, I have no clear or short answer to this. The other thing is with if you in some way can prime a certain condition, that's these threat scenarios, I think this is more clear in terms of different demands for certain situations in terms of causality. But with regard to ideology, yes, you would have to have some design that allows you to look into, is there certain trait that still has an impact over and above ideology? So I'm not sure. I'm afraid I cannot answer it. But as you just mentioned, Bert, this is what faces the personality psychology literature since the last couple of years. How to explain and better show this empirically, what's going on.
Would there be ways to actually like the priming scenarios that you do with Lasse, to do this with ideology?
I haven't thought about it, to be honest. If there is something that might be comparable, but
well, you need a lot bigger samples for because the effects are probably going to be very subtle, right?
Yeah. But I could think of, I don't know, if you have kind of a panel study that more or less would allow you to address this, I think this would be a way to go. But experimentally priming some ideological components, I'm not sure how to do this, but if you have ideas about it, I'm happy to hear that.
This is I'll give Ari Amalka the credits that he deserves for this idea, but we're Jif Laukus and I and Ari are working on a project where we're using the panel data, but we have also done experiments to actually prime ideology and see how that affects the association with pre-treatment ideology and self-reported psychological traits. So we're basically describing in the survey whether or not it's about politics and ask them a bunch of questions about politics or placebo control. So we say it's about it's about the internet. The effects are tiny and we are super well powered. So this is, but it might be one way forward. I'll send you the paper after this presentation. But
thanks.
I'm curious because I think I agree with you that this is a big question that we need to think about in terms of the sort of what does this mean? That's
right. But as I said, still it's I think it can contribute to this whole literature. So as I try to stress these ideology trait associations that we know that they exist, that they really can be found, and they can be found quite consistently. And this is one point that I wanted to address and show here, whether this is possible.
Yeah,
there seems to be some really important and unique associations. That's, I should say, unique in a way.
Okay. The next question is from Christian.
Julian, thanks for your talk. It was super interesting. I was wondering, in your results that you presented on the ideological differences between voters, between citizens and their demands, you showed that right-wing voters have a smaller demand for morality in a leader, and you said that you expected that was as expected. But I would have expected the opposite. Could you elaborate more on that? What's the understanding of morality here? Because from my background, I think conservatives with their views on family, sexuality, these kind of things, when we talk about morality, I would have expected a different relationship here.
Well, thanks, Christian. I know what you mean, and I agree. So in my presentation, I said that it's lower preference for morality. So the way I measured this, or we measured this in the study, was asking about someone. We had to find these opposite poles, so not to have it unipolar. So if someone regrets, kind of shows, if she would regret mistakes or shows no regrets, basically, and this is what is measured here. So it's about more being honest or modest about your behavior or your conduct. Actually, that's what I meant. That's what also has implications for kind of accountability. But I agree that in the US you would normally perhaps say that morality is something different, that is more on moral issues, if you will, and that conservatives, Republicans would score higher on that. That's why I agree with you. I think maybe it's the wrong label, and I should stress that more, but it falls into this category of communion morality traits as an overall label. but thanks for the question. I should be more clear, perhaps.
Yeah, thanks. I'm just wanted to, well, let me do that later. Question from Stan van Oost again. Thank you for your fascinating talk and answering my clarification question from before. Why are you planning on doing your follow-up study in the US? Would it be more interesting to again study Germany and Austria? I think you mean Germany and Denmark. This way you've fewer moving parts in the comparison with your current work. Also, the US having a president with a widely discussed personality might influence your data in a way that might decrease your ability to make generalized statements. Usually you get the other question, right? So you get the advice, do this in the US.
Exactly. Yes. I think that was, so that would have been my answer. Why not the US? But yeah, thanks, Sandy, for the question. I agree that, so first of all, it's a discussion about are there countries that matter more or less in terms of research? And I would expect most people would ask, why not study this in the US? But you're right, we could have kind of less degrees of freedom in terms of variations of what we find and study this in the same countries, meaning Germany and Denmark. So we'll think about it. Yeah, maybe the climate doesn't contribute, yes, doesn't contribute to what we want to achieve, but still, I think it's a very important case. And what makes it unique is that you really have a realistic scenario of going to war and armed conflict, unfortunately. So I don't know, in Denmark or in Germany, that is less likely, I would say. So you have to find a kind of artificial scenario where you have this, that you in some way really have a clash of an external force or some external power that attacks a country. In the US, this is more likely, unfortunately, I would say.
Maybe you can do some sort of experiment where you put kids like 16 years old on an island and then you study how. Okay, next question. Isabella Rebasso, thanks a lot for this talk. I think my question is similar to Bert's. I was wondering if you have considered or maybe tested whether desired traits reflect descriptions of personalities of current candidates rather than actual ideal types or worldviews. Are they more than just partisan motivated description of who's the current party leader? Could you perhaps compare partisans of similar parties in countries in which party leaders are quite different?
Oh, yeah. Well, thanks, Isabella. There's, I guess, more than one question in there that challenges what we've been doing. I'll try to read again. Yeah, how to show this, whether it's more than the description of the current party leader. This is quite difficult. I mean, of course, if you have partisans who would not agree or are really opposite to the current leader, for example, in Germany, then they will describe someone who is very much different from Merkel, for example. So what we should have done and what would be important is, I guess, some measure of sympathy for the politicians that are around in the political system. This we did not have, unfortunately. This should be a call for what to do next. So this is one way to go, to kind of have this as a comparison or control. The second question, partisans of similar parties in countries, different. So we don't have measures of actual politicians, but this is one of the at least building blocks that we want to achieve in the next project that I mentioned in the end, if you have seen that. So working with my colleagues at GASIS, so this would be one step to see if personality measure works also for describing real world politicians, of course. So to validate that and also to have the information, and then actual politicians that are widely known, at least, we will have some measures as well. Yeah, that's what I can say so far.
And yeah, the next question is also follows from this discussion, again from Alex Chaskevich. One idea could be to look at whether people's preferences for candidate traits change following a leadership contest. For instance, you survey a group of partisans prior to or during a leadership contest and resurvey them after a new leader has been chosen. You could see if preferences for leader personality shifts to reflect the chosen leader after the contest is resolved. I know some work in Poland that actually showed that the winning leader in a contest, he grew by 3 centimeters in the perception of the participants.
Right. Yeah, that's actually a good idea. So thanks, Alexander. So it's maybe difficult to foresee a leader change, but I would agree perhaps that this is a good idea to if a party changes leaders, what happens then? So we had this kind of frequently in the last years in Austria, at least. So, but maybe we could look into the data on that, because we have a panel running since 2017. Maybe there's something in there.
Yeah.
But that's a good idea. So thanks for that.
And of course, you can always ask your colleague Lawrence Enser to predict when leaders will be deselected. So he wrote a brilliant paper with someone about this.
So that's very good. Yeah, I will definitely contact him. Also with regard to candidate service in the future, I guess. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Let's see. I think. Oh, there's one more question again. Yeah, Martin Rosema. Hi, Julian. Nice to see you on the screen again. I see you have sort of a long-term screen relationship. I have a question about leader personality in general and how to conceptualize it. Some scholars in the past studied it with typologies that apply in particular to leaders, like James David Barber about active-passive and positive-negative. Others use concepts that apply to citizens too, like Big Five, Hexaco, etc. The latter approach seems more popular now. Do you think we lose anything with this approach, or do we still need people to study leaders with personality concepts developed for political leaders in particular? Best wishes.
Well, thanks, Martin. Yeah, we go back, I don't know, a couple of weeks maybe, so it's not a long-term relationship, but it's very nice to have at least a writing from you. So on the question, as I said, so at least that's my view. You can of course disagree that there's a bit of a disconnect between the older candidate trait literature and what is going on in personality psychology. But I think it's in some way more fruitful to use these very established frameworks to study personality, and I don't think we lose anything. It's really about matching them to certain traits and the expectations that come along with that. And I guess in some way it's when you talk about personality, it's a bit different. What you have seen in the candidate literature often are these has been called valence traits. So it's really about being good or bad on a certain trait. So are you competent or not? And this is I'm not sure whether this is personality as such. It's more an ability or a valence trait, and the same is with sympathy. I think that's not something that is measured or can be placed into personality as such. So these are different concepts, perhaps also what is personality. So that would be my answer. But at least for me, I found it very fruitful to try to map traits that have been used in the past, like Kinder and colleagues and so forth, and to try really to map them on certain aspects or facets of personality traits that are present in the psychological literature.
Martin says,
I hope that helps.
Like your trait focus. Okay. We've come at the end of our meeting already. So I want to thank Julian, and I will give the floor back again to Bert to do the outro and announce our next speaker.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Let me also thank you, Julian, for a really nice talk with like the nice layout of the findings that you had, those that were expected and those that were unexpected, and the discussion that followed this. I think that's what we should be doing. We have a very exciting program, I think, in the coming weeks. Well, we basically planned it up to December, but I won't bother you with all the names, but just to give you a little bit of a hint of what is coming. Next week, we have Stephen Webster from the University of Indiana, who will present his just published book on American rage, how anger shapes our politics. Well, we don't have to follow much news to see the relevance of that. September 18th, we have Catharine de Vries, now at Bocconi University in Italy. We'll talk about intergenerational conflict and COVID-19. And can I give you a couple more names? Yes. No, my screen is not loading. But I think other than Stephen and Catharine, in the coming weeks, we have exciting program with people like Jennifer Jarrett, Ashley Jardina, Robert Clemenson, Manos Tsakidis. So people from different subfields, different fields, different interests, but I think have all interesting things to say, to questions that you're all interested in, or at least that we are interested in. And if you are interested, you are very welcome to join every Friday from 3 to 4 on this Zoom webinar. I want to thank everybody for their participation. Good questions as always. I want to thank Julian once more for the presentation, and Christian as always for being our Zoom host or Zoom master as we call him informally. So I hope to see you all next Friday.